Welcome to the first lecture in the series of lectures on psychology of well-being. We all know that well-being has been understood in a variety of ways, a variety of perspectives, whether it is located within the person as a condition of good life, or it has been seen as a process, as an experience that is shaped by the context. The point in this particular lecture is to look at the need for locating the question of well-being within the hierarchical world. There's a general consensus that well-being is taken to be a pursuit for good life. And that's how psychologists, or rather psychologists who have reviewed the work on human well-being, is concerned. Good life is taken to be an important pursuit, which is termed as the pursuit for well-being. So welcome again. So what are the various questions or themes that we are going to take up in this particular presentation? Let's look at the first one, which takes us towards the popular images of well-being, which in the literature tells us something about it being an intra-psychic condition. In other words, we find that, or the reviewers of this concept of well-being tell us that it's predominantly taken to be a condition or an experience located within the person that leaves aside a variety of influences that the context, cultural, social, political, may have in shaping such experiences. That takes us towards some more input that we might like to have on the lived realities about having good life or having well-being. That also takes us back towards that very question of understanding well-being as having good life or promoting good life. So is that possible when we think of well-being in a hierarchical world? And we'll take up this question with the help of case of poverty and inequality in the world and also in India. Having said that, we would also like to get back to the very question that why is it necessary to locate human condition or the pursuit of good life or well-being in the hierarchical world? And we'll try and see that how, if well-being is denied to a variety of or to a majority of citizens of the world, what might be the reason behind that? And we'll take that up with the help of appeals of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to the American Psychological Association in 1968. We then will be moving towards, finally, the need to move beyond intra-psychic images of well-being, and we'll be taking examples from the COVID-19 pandemic situation in Indian setting, where we are going to see that it's going to be very important to look at the various kinds of social hierarchies that shape either having or not having a sense of good life. Because a sense of good life or well-being is located very much within the social hierarchies, very much within the social, cultural, and political context in which people live their lives. So let's move towards the popular images of well-being, and let's ask this question to ourselves: that is it really taken to be an intra-psychic condition? The answer is yes, but then we'll try and see that, as mentioned earlier, that are there some other important concerns as far as having good life or well-being goes. So we are familiar with the meanings and images of physical health. How about psychological health or well-being? Let's ask ourselves this question. What meanings or images come to my mind when I think of well-being? Let's give ourselves a minute of time in noting these meanings or images down. I would recommend that please pause the video for a minute for writing and then you can resume. Well, in general, our responses to the question of well-being are in line with what psychologists, economists, and other social scientists or medical scientists have conceptualized. They would talk about happiness, optimum psychological functioning, thriving, or in other words, having good life or existence in mental, personal, or relational terms. So if your responses match these various meanings given by psychologists who are taken to be important contributors in the mainstream psychology as far as understanding of well-being goes. Well, we understand that these are relevant images of human well-being in popular and academic discourses because, again, many of us who in fact can afford to have good life, conditions that promote good life, would be talking about such kinds of meanings like happiness, optimum functioning, etc. However, one major problem with such images is that these generally exclude the structural or historical context of inequality and indifference that a majority of world's populations suffer from. Let's begin with material or economic conditions of a majority of world's or India's population. So what are the lived realities of the excluded population, excluded part of the human population in the world, in India, about good life? I would take a recourse to the study by Pandey, and Priya, as they have noted a sense of alienation owing to lost dreams among the poor in India in their narrative of everyday life. It has been depicted in a Hindi song by a noted theatre artist called Piyush Mishra. What does Piyush tell us with the help of the narratives of everyday life of such poor people? Well, I would like to read it out for you. एक बगल में चांद होगा, एक बगल में रोटियां, एक बगल में नींद होगी, एक बगल में लोरियां, हम चांद पे रोटी की चादर डालकर सो जाएंगे और नींद से कह देंगे लोरी कल सुनाने आएंगे. Well, the meaning in English goes like this. On one hand, there is moon, aspirations or desires. On the other, food or survival. On one hand, there is sleep or tranquility. On the other, lullabies or aesthetics. We'll have to go for survival, keeping aside aspirations or desires. And we do not see soon a possibility of tranquility through aesthetic engagements. Piyush goes on, he says, एक बगल में खनखनाती सीपियां हो जाएंगी, एक बगल में कुछ रुलाती सिसकियां हो जाएंगी, हम सीपियों में भर के सारे तारे चुन के आएंगे और सिसकियों को गुदगुदी कर कर के यूं बहलाएंगे. In English, it can be translated as, on one hand there are clinking oyster shells, or fond memories of playful, spontaneous and exciting younger days. On the other, grief and sorrow that makes me cry. We'll gather all the stars and fill them in the oyster shells, or all existing dreams and playfulness of youthful past. And through these playful, exciting dreams and memories, we will caress our sorrow. Well, that's Piyush Mishra who tells us about the possibilities or lack of it as far as that of good life or well-being goes. We move on and see that there are several important concerns like this that has been exemplified by Piyush Mishra's in the song. That how about the following among the socioeconomically excluded? And these following concepts include that of happiness, optimum psychological functioning, thriving, having good life or existence. Important question is this, that for such poor, do these things really comprise their lived realities? Furthermore, what kind of good life or existence can we think of among people who have to manage their living with 1.9 US dollar a day? Now, important thing to note here is this, that 1.9 US dollar is also the marker of international poverty line, which is based on the consumption needs of a person, that how much a person needs as far as the money goes in terms of meeting the goods or services that the person consumes. So the person eats, the person studies, the person also nurtures his or her family. So how much per person it requires to have those services and goods that the person consumes, and that amounts to 1.9 US dollars. So how about people who do not have or who have to live their lives with less than this much amount of money? Let us look at the economically poor of the world in India more clearly. That takes us towards a very important question of the economic hierarchy in our society. And we have some data here regarding India from 1983 to 2011, that how many people in India have lived below 1.9 US dollars a day, 3.2 US dollar a day, and then it moves on from there to 5.5 and then to 10 US dollars a day. Now we find on the right hand side, top right hand side of this particular slide, that there are 26 crore or 268 million people in India as far as 2011 data goes from the World Bank, that they have to live below poverty line. And then if we look at the data closely, we find that 3.2 US dollar, which would be in terms of Indian rupees something like, between 200 or 250 Indian rupees. So 3.2 US dollars, below that there are about 75 crore people, which is almost like around 60% of Indian population living under 3.2 US dollar a day. Well, all this data also tells us something about this poverty line, as we have understood earlier. And this poverty line, as defined in 2015, is marked by 1.9 US dollar a day, and we have already seen that. What is the status as far as India goes, or Indian population goes? Well, according to Roser and Ortiz Ospina, their article, as per the World Bank data of the year 2011, about 10% population of the world, and 21.2% of India live below that international poverty line. Also, about 60% of Indian population has to live with less than 3.2 US dollar a day, that we have already mentioned earlier. The poorest in the world are often hungry, as they point out, have much less access to education, regularly having no light at night, and suffer from much poorer health. So that's the condition that we are talking about as the lived reality of people within these hierarchies, particularly the economic hierarchy. And the question is, what kind of good life or well-being that can be imagined for them? Well, the idea is not to paralyze all of us by thinking about the difficult conditions that the poor of the world, that constitutes a majority of human population, has to live with. But to ask the simple question, that how has the discussion about well-being excluded the structural or historical context of inequality and indifference that a majority of the world's population bear the brunt of? Now, it's going to be very, very important that we deal with this particular question, which rarely has been dealt with in the mainstream literature on well-being in general, particularly when we talk about psychology. Well, to initiate this particular discussion, I would like to take all of us towards Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s talk to the American Psychological Association that he delivered in 1968. And I would like to quote parts of his speech, as it has been documented in Jesse Jackson's article titled "What Ought Psychology to Do?" published in the American Psychologist in the year 2000. And this is how it goes. Jackson says, Dr. King praised this group and noted that psychologists are charged with solemn mission of helping people live well-adjusted, fulfilling lives, but with a caveat. He challenged you to foster what he called creative maladjustment. By that he meant people should question the precepts of society and reject those that permit injustice to form and grow. He viewed the social sciences as instruments of social change, saw their mission as the extirpation, of evil. He appealed to you to observe and report fully and accurately the complexity of our societal relations. Further, he called for research on how structural change designed to promote a more just society might be crafted and implemented. As one can infer from Jackson and King, their talk, inequality and indifference emanate not only from economic class but also from various kinds of hierarchies that many a time we remain complacent about, and in our complacency we are allowing such kind of hierarchies to form and grow, and these include race, ethnicity, gender, religion, or caste. Well, recently COVID-19 in India has laid bare these hierarchies that urge us to think of well-being beyond its prevailing popular intra-psychic conception, as these may silence the very everyday realities of struggles towards good life or well-being among the majority of our population. Well, as far as understanding well-being or locating well-being within social hierarchies goes, it's definitely going to be interesting as an example at how post-pandemic situation, or mid-pandemic situation rather, that all of us are in right now, when we are talking about it in August 2020. So let's see how this tells us about the question of locating well-being or struggles for that that many of us, many of the people within human population have to go through on an everyday basis. And here comes pandemic that perhaps amplifies that further. So important thing is to again see that how, as Pandey and his colleagues have pointed out through their work, that several sections of the society face the brunt of exclusion and re-traumatization due to resurfacing of several hierarchies, as a majority of citizens are compelled to undergo experiences of either dehumanization that migrant laborers had to go through, not only because of survival question, but also stigma of being virus spreaders. Besides dehumanization, denial of voice and double exclusion amongst people or amongst women particularly who face gender-based violence and discrimination, especially amongst the Dalit women in India. Assault on religious identity through stigma faced by religious groups like Muslims. Marginalization enhanced by hazardous living conditions of people living in the villages as well as in the slums in the urban areas. And that constitutes a majority of citizens living in these kinds of difficult life conditions, whether we call it rural or urban slums. Then literal exclusion at workplace and from residential areas due to stigma, and that was faced by our own lifesavers, doctors and medical staff. Some details we are going to go into as we move ahead in this particular talk. Well, let's look at the gender-based denial of voice and double exclusion, especially lived by the Dalit women, as an example of their pursuit or struggle in the pursuit of well-being. Well, as the cases of gender-based or domestic violence have increased, it enhances a sense of exclusion. And I would like to quote Pandey and his colleagues. Although helplines are available for help during such troubled times of domestic violence or gender-based violence, the calling device, landline or mobile phone, and the safe space away from the gaze of oppressing in-laws or family members to call the helpline are not available to the victims. Dalit women who are the sole earners of livelihood for their families working as domestic labor may face potential double exclusion from their families for being unproductive and at the workplace for being super spreaders. From gender-based or gender hierarchy, let's move on to the assault on the basis of religious hierarchy or religious identity because of stigma. So religious congregations was banned for all the religions during the lockdown period of the pandemic in India, but some violations were addressed and others were not. Pandey and his colleagues have quoted observations by Ellis Peterson and Rahman. It goes like this: while the Muslims have now seen their businesses across India boycotted, volunteers distributing rations called coronavirus terrorists and others accused of spitting in food and infecting water supplies with the virus. Posters have appeared barring Muslims from entering certain neighborhoods in states as far apart as Delhi, Karnataka, Telangana, and Madhya Pradesh. We move on to another hierarchy in terms of access to proper living conditions that may be non-hazardous. And let's look at what Khan and Abraham in their analysis have to tell us, as quoted in Pandey and his colleagues' work. 60% of Indian households has less than a room per capita, which means per person, making home quarantine extremely difficult. 40% urban and 75% rural houses do not have in-house or within residential areas water facility for household purposes to avoid community visits and maintain social distancing during the lockdown period or during the pandemic itself. 33% of Indian households do not have drinking water facility within the house or residential areas, out of which 73% households send women to fetch drinking water, risking infection. Now we are talking about good life, or rather the conditions that might promote good life or well-being. And here are the examples. Well, we move on further and see that 8% of Indians use community bathrooms and latrines, and 25% do not have any such facility within or outside their houses at all. What does that mean? 8% of Indians do not have these kinds of facilities for their basic hygiene and sanitation maintenance. So moving on, we find that exclusion at workplace and from residential areas amongst the lifesavers who are the doctors and medical staff. Why so? Because of the stigma of being spreaders of coronavirus. Well, again, Pandey and their colleagues have quoted the work by Alice Peterson and Rahman, and they have to say this about one nurse who was evicted from her rented house by the landlord due to the fear of being a virus spreader. The authors pointed out her miseries. The nurse said she and her children had been forced to move in with her mother, who lives in a single-room house in a slum. 5 of us, she says, have to huddle in that 10 feet by 10 feet room now, she said. I'm working on 12-hour shifts in my hospital. It's all extremely exhausting. And now I have to find a new place to live. But if people know that I work as a nurse in a big city hospital, no one will be willing to rent out an apartment to me. Now look at that misery. Look at that, again, impact of social hierarchy amongst people who have to struggle for their well-being because of, again, such social. Again, dehumanization among the migrant laborers as they fend for their survival amidst fear of viral infection, stigma of being virus spreaders and facing life-threatening reverse migration towards their villages. They are too tired of waiting to be empathized or cared for. The Hindi song mentioned earlier in this presentation says more, again recalling that Hindi song by Piyush Mishra, and that all tells us something about the kind of forced realities that they have been forced to live with, where they perhaps keep waiting for some sort of care. They struggle for some sort of care, but ultimately, when it doesn't arrive, they are perhaps too tired to wait for the same, and they have their own ways of then finding some solace in this particular world. Let's look at what Piyush Mishra, that Hindi artist, that Hindi songwriter, has to say. And he says, अम्मा तेरी सिसकियों पे कोई रोने आएगा, गम न कर जो आएगा वो फिर, कभी ना जाएगा, याद रख पर कोई अनहोनी नहीं तू लाएगी, लाएगी तो फिर कहानी और कुछ हो जाएगी. So the mother, being comforted and cautioned by her child, tells her that, Mother, someone will visit us who will sympathize with your sorrow. Do not feel sad, as the visitor will not abandon you again. But you make sure that you do not create any crisis or disharmony to your life. If you create disharmony, it will be a different story, or mental peace will be lost. Now, what does the mother has to say to the child in her reply? होनी और अनहोनी की परवाह किसे है मेरी जान, हद से ज्यादा यही होगा कि यहीं मर जाएंगे, हम मौत को सपना बताकर उठ खड़े होंगे यहीं, और होनी को ठेंगा दिखाकर खिलखिलाते जाएंगे. So in translation, mother telling her child, who cares about destiny or disharmony, dear? The worst would be that I shall die here only. We will think of death as a dream or long sleep in which we are alive, which makes us embark on a new journey, and thus, mocking at our destiny and giggling, we will move on towards that new journey. So that's the reality of social hierarchies based on a variety of ways that we have seen, be it class, be it economic class rather, be it gender, be it religion. We have seen that it's also the hazardous living conditions that people have to be in, and what kind of prejudice or stigma that we have about the virus spreaders that also includes our lifesavers, our doctors and medical staff. All these things takes us back to the very question of happiness, that is it sufficient enough to consider or to perhaps exclusively, almost exclusively focus on happiness as a kind of condition that the person finds within oneself. Again, that has to be emphasized. And we have seen a variety of ways in which mainstream psychology conceptualizes well-being as happiness. We are aware of Ed Diner's work, or as optimum psychological functioning. We are reminded of the recent Carol Reeves work since 1980s and 90s. We are also aware of other contributors to the understanding or the intra-psychic understanding of well-being in terms of Seligman's work on thriving. Important thing is this, that we have reached a time where, just as some of the psychologists have started waking up to the whole importance that we need to bring in as far as understanding the very social, cultural, political context in which well-being or good life is shaped as far as human population goes. And we have already seen in this talk that even if we simply take a look at economic conditions of people, we find that 10% of entire human population has to live below international poverty line that's marked by 1.9 US dollar a day. Now, that's something which is just the minimum. We also have seen that there are other variety of social hierarchies, not only the economic hierarchy, but also other kinds of social hierarchy that needs to be taken into account in order to even touch the very experience of having good life or the struggles of good life that human population has to go through. As this is a lecture series, we are going to look at a variety of ways that it is being attempted now, at least in terms of
research in the area of well-being that has been done by community and critical psychology people. We'll be looking into that later on in some other lecture, but for now, get finally what I have to say regarding the need for contextualizing the understanding of well-being. So, if COVID-19 in India has laid bare various hierarchies that may silence the very everyday realities of struggles towards good life or well-being amongst the majority of our population, following efforts are required for a holistic understanding of well-being. The first one, rethinking well-being beyond its prevailing popular intra-psychic conception that goes in the concepts like happiness, optimum psychological functioning, thriving, or having good life. Excuse me. And then finally, a systematic, paradigm informed understanding of well being in which resurfacing and reshaping of social hierarchies within prevailing economic or neoliberal world order may be initiated. So the next talk is going to be on trying to dig a bit deeper in understanding that how do these various kinds of social hierarchy remain as it is. It doesn't move. We have already seen in this particular lecture that since 1983 there isn't much change as far as poverty goes in India. So what are the various aspects of our global and national level context as far as economic or social policies go that creates different kinds of challenges for well-being to be pursued or good life to be pursued by a majority of Indian population or world's population. So the next lecture would be on locating well-being or the question of well-being within the new liberal world order. Thank you very much.